We now come to 28, and poor Sidon gets the short end of the stick here. They only get 5 verses. We're back to the Ammons and the Moabites and the Edomites and so forth. And so we have a little P.S. down here at the end of chapter 28, where the word of the Lord came to me and said, "Son of man, set your face against Sidon," which, by the way, is not too far away from Tyre and is also a Phoenician city, and kind of the second one in line, but very much involved within the Tyre maritime enterprise. And he says, "Say to her, this is what the Lord says, I'm against you, Sidon, and I will gain glory within you. They will know that I am the Lord when I inflict punishment on her and show myself holy within her. I will send a plague upon her and make blood flow in her streets, and the slain will fall within her, and the sword against her will be on every side." Now, God's judgment upon her is primarily discussed here. It's just there's going to be a plague and there's going to be death by the sword. God's judgment was for good. It was not for evil. So that they will know that I am Yahweh. Again, it may sound like a broken record. Boy, if you think it may be getting old for you, and we're only in day 4, how would you like to be the poor exiles? How would you like to be Ezekiel? Man, it went on for years, hearing this. Unfortunately, they didn't get the message. But again, God's going to glorify himself when the Sidonians finally realize that he truly is Yahweh and God. And that's a significant concept that is here. Verse 24, "No longer will the people of Israel have malicious neighbors who are painful briars and sharp thorns. Then they will know that I am Adonai Yahweh." This kind of summarizes the previous judgments against the nations, messages and oracles up to this point. When these judgments are completed, then Israel will be free from the despising, harassing nations and the constant pricking and pain that she has endured for so long. That doesn't make Israel right in any means, but it was equally not right for the nations to either take advantage of her, taunt her, mock her, do all those things for him. And God is faithful again to his promises to eliminate her oppressors. And that's one thing that's going to happen here in Ezekiel. We have these oppressors, and we have these judgments. And we're going to have the ultimate situation with Gog and Magog, where you're going to have the last great try. And it doesn't work. It's over, guys. No more. There'll be no more foreign oppressors. And we're kind of building in that direction. Okay? We also have an interesting statement in light of that as well at the very conclusion of the chapter 25, when he says, "I will gather the people of Israel from the nations." See, we've been talking about the nations. I'm going to gather the people from the nations where they have been scattered, and I will show myself holy among them in the sight of the nations. So the nations will see. So they're going to be a witness. This is going to be a witness to them. "Then they will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. They will live there in safety, and will build houses and plant vineyards, and they will live in safety when I inflict punishment on all the neighbors who malign them." Let's say we're going to see the climax of that when we come to 38 and 39. "Then they will know that I am Yahweh, their God." Now we've been having these little statements of restoration. They've been coming along. They're just little statements, but we've had them coming along all the way, and then we're going to get those further developed here very shortly.
You seem to be throughout the judgments of the nations, they seem to be looking at it as something very near in the future. And are we to take 24 through 26 there as more of a millennial fulfillment, more of an end times fulfillment? Because I don't remember ever, please correct me if I'm wrong, of Israel being free from any malicious neighbors.
Not at this time, no. Well, they were free in their captivity because they weren't there. If we want to look at it that way. I'm glad you raised the question, because this reflects a whole mindset, you might say, of prophetic literature, and from a Hebrew perspective that I think is very strategic. When we come to a text, we tend to want, I don't know why it is, maybe it's our culture, our societies, the greater tendency is to want to have an immediate effect. It happened, okay, now happen. Hebrews don't do that. Again, I stress to you, they speak conceptually. Okay, so you have to look at the concept. Concept here is that there will be restoration, and there is a time in the progression of God's working, when the judgments have taken place, that Israel will be free from the oppression, and they'll be free from these things, and they'll be restored to the land. Now, that can happen, that concept can happen in part and in different ways for some time. It's as if, I view it in this way, it's as if you're looking down to the future and you say, there's going to be restoration. And they put it all together in one bag. Yes, there is going to be the restoration from the Babylonian captivity. And there's an extent to which, when they come back to the land, they're much freer than they were before. Not entirely, as we well know. If we go to Ezra, because you got, the guys that are harassing them. But compared to what it was, it's better. But there's that one. The next one. Ultimately, there's the full fruition. It's the term I would use. I wouldn't use the word fulfillment. There's the full fruition of the concept at the end time. That's the final grand finale of the concept. And that's true with so much of the prophetic writing. And our problem is, we would like for them to, okay, would you please segment these things out? Okay, be sure and tell me, is this one the Babylonian captivity or not? Oh, you say, yeah, it's part of it. What do you mean part? We just don't like that. That's why we run to the New Testament. Boy, I like it, man. That Greek. And look at the languages. Look at what God did. He sovereignly chose Greek to give the propositional statements and the very logical development. But he uses Hebrew to give the descriptions of the concepts. So we have to be careful about that, and we have to recognize that it's not. I don't like the terms where people talk about multiple fulfillment. That's not what it is. We're trying to cram Hebraic thinking into, a Western Greco-Roman type of thinking. And you cannot do that. Any of you that are from foreign countries and you know more than one language, you recognize that you cannot do a word-for-word translation. You cannot move things in the time of culture. There's some places where certain words in one language you don't have in the other language, certain concepts. So what is it in this context? How are they thinking? And so I think that's the difficult. So I would say here, I think for them, he says, when I gather the people from Israel from the nations where they've been scattered, I will be holy among them in the sight of the nations. I think that was true at in the return from the Babylonian captivity. For the nations at that time, for Israel, he demonstrated himself holy among them, but that's not it. They ultimately are going to live in full safety and build their houses, and he's even building this in Ezekiel. As I say, when we come now to 38, 39, we're at the grand finale. And this is the final, last time, because there it's talking about in the end times, in the latter days. It gets more specific, not as specific as we might like, but it's using terminology that is very clearly to them, that's something down there. I don't know if I can fully see it. That's down there. It's not coming soon. I hope this helps, because I think this is the only way we can fully understand what's going on in some of these texts, where it's a yes and type of situation, because they're thinking of the concept. They're not wound up and bound to the specific. It's this and it's more.
It's just kind of scary to me as someone who is supposed to explain this text to people.
Yes.
As I go through it, and you see there's the fulfillments are for Ezekiel's time, and they're there, and then all of a sudden you come to something, it's like an abrupt stop in the interpretation, and all of a sudden you have this glimpse of, like you said, thinking more conceptually, and it scares me.
Yes, it does.
That, wow, am I supposed to make this leap?
Yes, I understand that. Scares us because we're not Hebrews. Really. Wouldn't scare them. Oh, yes. But you see, he does give us some help along the way. Even when he was talking about Tyre and talking about the waves coming. Well, see, there's the example. It was true with Babylon, Persia, Greece, Saracens, all down the line. See, the concept. And it's going to take waves to do that. Again, this is part of our cultural historical hermeneutic. We have to. I used to have a little button that I'd give my students: think Hebrew. Think like they think. And it's hard for us because we don't. I understand that, and it's something we have to continually be in the text and immerse ourselves in the way they think. And that takes time. And that's probably why. And these things, you're right, it scares us. That's a good phrase. I like that. It does. It's scary. Why? Because I'm not used to that. I don't like that. And in some ways, I've been taught exegetically to be more Western. At least I have no idea how. I haven't been in any of your exegesis classes, but I know that there's a tendency to, because the stress is upon the New Testament. Old Testament gets the narrow end of the deal often. Why don't we have as many hours of Hebrew as we do Greek? I didn't say that. Okay. But we need to think, and I think that's why you don't hear a lot of preaching from the Old Testament, because it's narrative to start with. Well, how do you come to the principles in narrative? Especially what do you do in a book like Genesis? There's no comments at all, whether it's bad or good. At least in the book of Kings, the guy stops every once in a while and says, "This is the worst guy in the world ever lived." At least you have some idea. But when you read narrative, you have to remember what you read. So when you come to the situation, let's say of one who wants to marry a second wife, and you say, is it right or not? What did God say before? You see, and so you got to think more, and you got to reflect, and you got to see the flow of thought. And as I was saying to one of you, the same thing happens. That's why you don't hear as much preaching about in the Gospels either. Because why? It's narrative. And we don't know what to do with that. We like the good old Pauline stuff. And Pauline stuff, great. Don't get me wrong. I did my master's in Greek New Testament, so I love it. The reason I did my doctorate in Old Testament is because I wanted to be completely fulfilled. Okay? I wanted to be as fully equipped as I could be, and I still recognize I've got a long ways to go. But you'll always be that way. But we need to think Hebrew. I don't know what else to say. We need to kind of try to become one of them. All right. Let's move now to the largest section of judgment upon the nations, which is upon Egypt. Egypt, remember historically what we've been dealing with. Egypt was down here to the southwest of Israel. Egypt is the one who, when Babylon came against the Assyrians after the collapse of the Assyrians up at Haran, and then later at Carchemish. It was Egypt that wanted to come and help out the Assyrians, and it was Egypt who initially, in the defeat of Josiah by Pharaoh Necho in 609, took control of Judah, and they've always wanted to control Judah. And Egypt was the one that the people of Judea and the exiles were placing their hope in against Babylon. So you have the contrast to Babylon was Egypt, and really if you go back and look at it historically, there's no comparison. Okay, Egypt, though they had some fairly strong pharaohs like Hophra, or Ophris is his other name, he didn't compare to Nebuchadnezzar. There really isn't any comparison. And they will be the ones upon whom Judah will lean, the one to whom Judah will turn for security. And part of their judgments we're going to see is they did not help them at all when all was said and done. Okay? And they created a situation that gave them extreme difficulty at that point. Okay, so the prophecies against Egypt are very intricately woven together in their history. So that's why you have all these little dates up here. And this is all happening now during and following the siege that's going upon Jerusalem. And we cannot separate the two apart from one another. So in some ways we have to keep our chronology pretty clear at this point as the Egyptian forces take place and as we have these statements about them. So this now brings us to the situation of the first of these messages that we have. The first of them beginning in chapter 29, verse 1. And this message is going to take us through verse 16. And let me just give you somewhat of a summary. What's going to happen is in the first message here in 29, 1 to 16, we're going to see Egypt's complete desolation and destruction because of their pride and because they are unreliable support to Judah. It's because of their pride and being an unreliable support to Judah. We're going to see in a third prophecy these things developed out. But the second prophecy, and let me say something about the second prophecy that begins in verse 17. Because if you notice at the beginning of 29, in the 10th year, in the 10th month, on the 12th day. And then notice verse 17. In the 27th year, in the first month, on the first day. And then, notice in 30 verse 20, in the 11th year, in the first month, in the 7th day. Whoops. What are you doing, Ezekiel? You've been so nice and chronological for us at this time, up to this point. And now we are getting this kind of mishmash over here that's taking place, and we don't know what to do with that. He is following a historical, primarily even through the Egyptian times. But, he is following the chronological, but he is predominantly following a thematic because he wants to make things clear and he wants things to be understood at this point. This is providing a transition, in a sense, from Tyre to Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar is the instrument of judgment on Tyre, but since he did not secure the spoils of Tyre, as we've already implied, God would give Egypt as the spoils, and there would be, with this, we would have a knowledge of the ultimate judgment that would come upon them, And then each succeeding prophecy of these 6 things will be better understood because we understand what happens to Egypt and where everything goes in that context. So, when we come to this, we're going to see the introduction here of Pharaoh and the judgment, basically, that he will fall. Okay? He is going to be taken, the Pharaoh, as the king. But then we will pick up the very last message in the book from 571. That's the 27th year. Because that's the message of the final fall of Egypt. And he's going to move it up thematically so you see the 2 bookends. So you recognize what was proclaimed and did it really happen. And he wants that to be seen so that then you understand the details of how it all progresses that he will then follow with the other messages. Otherwise, you don't know the end of the matter. So, as we come to 29:1 in this message, the Pharaoh is likened to a crocodile. Now, I don't know what your translation says. I know that the NIV has monster. There weren't any monsters in Egypt. I don't know what kind of a monster it is. The word is equally rendered and used in the sense of a crocodile, and that the Egyptians know about real well in light of the Nile. It was a very common figure that they used. Pharaoh is likened to a crocodile that the Lord would catch and pull it out of the Nile and leave it out on the dry land to die. So he says, I'm against you, in verse 3, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great crocodile lying among your streams. You say, the Nile is mine. Okay, that's my domain, is the Nile. By the way, Egypt is the Nile. Have you ever been to Egypt? Well, if you go to Egypt, the widest point probably you're going to get maybe 30 miles of valley. And it's nice and green and beautiful as you go along the Nile with all the irrigation. Without it, it wouldn't be. But with all the irrigation, it's nice and green. And it's so green, but when the water stops, the sand starts. I have pictures, I don't have them here, literally, where I am standing with 1 foot on the sand and 1 foot in the grass. Okay? That's how sharp the demarcation can be. So Egypt is the Nile, historically. Get outside of that and you're in the desert, guy. Maybe they call it still part of their land, but it's not worth much for you. So he's going to put out on the dry land to die. And I said the imagery is most fitting to the Egyptians because the crocodile was the most common, fearful creature of the Nile. The crocodile god, which is Sebek, is important to them as Egypt's protector. And I think in that sense, the Pharaoh is viewed also as the protector of Egypt. By the way, Pharaoh was a god as well in those days. And so to use the imagery of a crocodile is a very appropriate one for that. So he is the protector of Egypt. Now, this crocodile in this context happens to be Hophra, Hophra, Pharaoh at this time, who had a very arrogant self-image. Isn't it interesting? All these leaders, they think they're all wonderful. What is it about leadership that does that to people? They all think that they're the most wonderful thing in the world. You know, they're arrogant, they're proud, and so forth. As I say, it's a real warning to us. It's almost, oh God, don't let me be a leader. You know, I mean, it's almost the way you feel at that point. Because the temptations, and if you're successful, pride can come so easy in that situation. Herodotus implied, the Greek writer later, that Pharaoh Aphrys, which is the other name of Hophra, was so strong in his position that he felt no god could dislodge him. Well, that really enhances our understanding of what it was that he was so self-arrogant. In his reign, he left carnage everywhere for the birds and the animals. And what we read here He says, I'm against you, you great monster. I'm going to put you up on the stream. I'm going to put hooks in your jaws, and I'll make the fish in the stream stick to your scale, and I'll pull you out from among your streams with all the fish sticking to it. Now, the fish are like, those people that are hanging on to him, following his leadership. And I will leave you in the desert, you and all the fish in your streams, and you will fall in the open field and not be gathered or picked up, and I will give you as food to the beasts of the earth and to the birds of the air. That's a phrase that's used throughout Scripture as far as when you have the carnage that takes place and even gets all the way to the book of the Revelation. You're not going to understand Revelation, by the way, if you don't understand the Old Testament. Don't even start. Go back and take an Old Testament course before you do that. And all who live in Egypt will know that I am Yahweh. Also, you have been a staff of reed for the house of Israel. When they grasp you with their hands, to lean upon you, you splintered and tore open their shoulders. And when they leaned on you, you broke and their backs were wrenched. Beautiful description, isn't it? The imagery is phenomenal. You're like a reed. You broke. When they tried there to grasp you, you splintered and tore their shoulder. And when they leaned on you, you wrenched their back. You haven't been very supportive of them. They should not have depended upon you. They should have depended upon Yahweh. But when they even tried to depend upon you, you were a poor support for them. Therefore, here's the judgment. This is what Adonai Yahweh says, I will bring the sword against you and kill your men and your animals. Egypt will become a desolate wasteland. And they will know at that point that I am Yahweh. That is the whole purpose again, that we see it whether it refers to Judah, whether it refers to any of the nations. The purpose is that they are to know Yahweh. Both the Pharaoh and Egypt will perish. The land will become desolate, as we read here, because the sword comes against them. It will be because of their pride, and it will affect the entire country. So there's not a lot of encouragement for them at this point when he brings this judgment. He says, because you said the Nile is mine, I made it. No, you didn't. There's that pride factor. Therefore I'm against you and against your streams, and I will make the land of Egypt a ruin, a desolate waste, from Migdal to Aswan, as far as the border of Cush. In other words, the whole length of the country, from north to south. I'll let you look up all the geographical places. No foot of man or animal will pass through it. No one will live there for 40 years. I will make the land of Egypt desolate among devastated lands, and her cities will lie desolate 40 years among the ruins. And I will disperse the Egyptians among the nations and scatter them among the countries. What does that sound like? That sounds like we're talking to Judah about the dispersion and the captivity. Well, we're talking about Egypt and her dispersion, captivity, which was at the same time by the same people, Babylon. Do you ever know about that? Do you ever know they went into captivity? They went in for 40 years. It appears that if we look at extra-biblical history, that their collapse to Babylon actually took place about 568. And so if you put their 40, or at least in the earliest, you put their 40 years when they came, that's when they finally fell. We don't know exactly when their 40 years began, but they probably came back a little after the people of Judah came back from Babylon. And it would have been under the time of the Persians. Okay? For 40 years they're going to be gone, and 40 years they'll be scattered among the nations, as we read in verse 12. Okay? And this took place at the hand of the Babylonians. We know this also in references in later messages that take place. So, they went into captivity. Then we read in verse 13, and this is what the sovereign Lord says, at the end of 40 years I will gather the Egyptians from the nations where they have been scattered and bring them back from captivity and return them to Upper Egypt. the land of their ancestry, and they will be a lowly kingdom. It will be the lowliest of kingdoms and will never again exalt itself above the nations. I will make it so weak that it will never again rule over the nations. Egypt will no longer be a source of confidence for the people of Israel, but will be a reminder of their sin and turning to her for help. Then they will know that I am Adonai Yahweh. With the captivity and the restoration of Egypt. I don't know if you ever put that into your picture, but we now know that for 40 years. Israel and Judah, Judah's was for 70. For Egypt, it was 40. And God's going to bring them back, but when he brings them back, they will be a lowly nation and they'll never again be a prominent nation. By the way, they still aren't. Yes, I realize they're in the Middle East, but they're not what we'd call a prominent nation, even at that time. Okay? So they're restored to Upper Egypt. Do you know what part of Egypt is Upper Egypt? Yeah, stand on your head. Yeah. And you'll get Upper Egypt. If you're not used to the uppers and lowers, and you look at the map, you think it's the Mediterranean. Isn't that always up on the maps? No, Upper Egypt is this way. Why is this Upper Egypt? Down, south. Higher elevation. Right, absolutely. Okay, so they're going to be restored, never be a great nation again. And the purpose of God is still the same. Now we go to verse 17, to the 27th year in the first month of the first day. We go to the very last message that Ezekiel gave. And this is it. 27:17 to 30, chapter 30, verse 19. And here we have the message that we've already talked about with respect to Tyre in passing, of Nebuchadnezzar's compensation for his siege of Tyre. As a fulfillment of God's judgment upon Tyre, the Babylonian army laid siege to Tyre for 13 years. We know this from Josephus, as far as the time factor. The scant historical date at this point indicates that Egypt and Tyre became allies, and that Pharaoh Hophra, as I've said, perhaps gave aid to the Tyrians. And that we know that Tyre surrendered in 573 after that 13 years, and Babylon gained almost no spoils at all from the long siege. We read in verse 18, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, drove his army in a hard campaign against Tyre. Every head was rubbed bare and every shoulder made raw. These guys worked at the siege. I mean, it implies, they were having to carry the stuff and lay and build the siege walls and build the ramparts and so forth to get the siege engines up against the walls and so forth. They worked hard for 13 years. Yet his army got no reward from the campaign he led against Tyre. Boy, can you imagine where they didn't get paid? Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I'm going to give Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will carry off its wealth. He will loot and plunder the land as pay for his army. And I have given him Egypt as a reward for his efforts because he and his army did it for me, that is against Tyre, declares Adonai Yahweh. On that day I will make a horn grow out for the house of Israel, and I will open your mouth among them, and then they will know that I am Yahweh. Now, Egypt is going to be the compensation. We just had in the first message that Egypt is he's going to be pulled out of the, Pharaoh is going to be pulled out of the Nile, and he's going to be stuck up there along with his people and die as if he were in the desert, and they're going to be going to captivity for 40 years, but ultimately be restored. And for the first time, God's instrument of judgment upon Egypt is explicitly announced in this message that we just saw. There's going to be Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar died in 562. So the desolation of Egypt by his army had to happen before then. And as I said, we already have fragmentary evidence that this took place probably around 568, 567 BC. And God used the Babylonian conquest to strengthen and encourage the exiles of Israel in the land of Babylon. Just as all of these are, they're encouragements to them that God is faithful to what he has promised. And those that are against God's people will receive their reward, if we can put it that way, on that. And the concept that perhaps here at the very end seems a little bit strange to us is the phrase, make a horn grow. This can be understood in two different ways because of the horn symbolism. A horn is a literal horn, but a horn is also used in the descriptive and the pictorial aspects of the Hebrews, which we get scared of, and I understand that. He says it can mean normally as a picture of strength. It can also be that of a leader or a ruler. In other words, the leader is the horn to them. Some think horns refer here to the Messiah because that term is used with respect to the Messiah himself. I do not think that the Messiah is in view at this point. There's no Messiah or any other ruler that came out of Israel at 586 BC, certainly at that point. It would probably be best to take in this as a picture of strength, though it could be that there will ultimately be a ruler, but it doesn't make sense to me in that sense in light of the phrase that comes after. It says, and I will open your mouth among them. In other words, in the context here, it would seem better to say, on that day I will make the strength of the house of Israel grow. The horn will grow for them. They will be emboldened and strengthened because Egypt has fallen. And you see, they wouldn't know that if you were just stuck with the first message. But since he moves the very last message thematically to the front, for us who are the readers, it becomes very clear right off that this is a done deal and it's finished. In other words, what is prophesied in the first message is fulfilled in the last message. And he puts them back to back so that you can see that. And that, therefore, means that the exiles will be emboldened and strengthened, and his mouth then will be open to proclaim to them things. And as would relate, I think, in part to that night before the message comes to them. To proclaim the message to the people and to walk freely among them. This brings us to the latter half of this, where the invasion, chapter 30, verses 1 to 19. This is all one message from 29:17 through 30:19. We go from one chronological date to the message to the next. So he has made this statement about the kingdom and about the fact that Nebuchadnezzar will receive his compensation that will be Egypt. And then we have the description of that invasion of Nebuchadnezzar given in details. Chapter 29 just simply says it's going to be like a crocodile pulled out of the water. The beginning of 17 says it's going to be Nebuchadnezzar who is going to come against you. He's going to receive Egypt as his pay. And now let me give you a description of how this happens in 31 to 19. And he says here, say this, wail and say, alas for that day, for the day is near, the day of the Lord is near, a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. A sword will come against Egypt, and anguish will come upon Cush. When the slain fall in Egypt, her wealth will be carried away, and her foundations will be torn down. Cush, Put, Lydia, Arabia, Libya, all and the people of the covenant land will fall by the sword along with Egypt. This is what the Lord says. We'll take up what he says here a little bit more. It's the day of the Lord here. Now, if you study the prophets at all, you realize it's a very common phrase. And some of our prophets like Zephaniah and a good portion of Joel and so forth, that's a major theme where they talk about the day of the Lord. But if you read that carefully, and if you read the use of that phrase throughout the Scripture and among the prophets, you realize that there are many days of the Lord. It's again one of those things that's conceptual, okay? And it works itself well out. And there is, if I can now use the definite article, there is the day of the Lord at the last one. Okay? But that doesn't mean that that's the one that's this one here. And here he's talking about a day of the Lord that will come upon Egypt. By the way, this is not upon Judah. And this is a day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord is any time where God works in a particular situation, normally to bring judgment followed by some aspects of blessing. Okay? But you can have different ones because it's the concept and it can be applied and worked out in different times of judgments. So there is a sense in which it's a technical term that has a basic concept of doom and of difficulty and darkness, though we have some of them saying there'll never be one. Joel will tell you about the day of the Lord down there, say there'll never be one like this and there never will be again. Okay, so hey, whoa, we got to stop and think. We got some descriptors here that say this is the big daddy, so to speak, of all days of the Lord, and this isn't just one of them that takes place. So in the context here, this day of the Lord relates specifically to God's judgment upon Egypt through Babylon. It's a day of Egypt. Notice in verse 9. Verse 9 he uses, on that day the messenger will go out with me in the ships to frighten Cush out of her complacency. Anguish will take hold of them on the day of Egypt's doom. This is a day of Egypt and their day of doom, for it is sure to come. So that gives us a further qualifier that this is contemporary, an immediate day of doom that's coming, which, as I mentioned, probably now from the time is imminent when this message is given at 571. In light of what we know extra biblically appearing that the collapse of Egypt, and this happened in 568 or /567, we're only talking about 2 or 3 years. This thing's coming right now for them, for Egypt. But for the time when it's placed in the order thematically, he's simply telling us, I'm going to tell you what happens in the fulfillment of the prophecy that I gave you in the first 16 verses of chapter 29. Now, notice the issues that take place in the day of the Lord and why the masses would fear. As Egypt's strength, their pride, verse 6, their idolatry, all this, it will cease. Many people will be slain. You read through this passage and you got people being slain in verse 6, and verses 10 and 11, verse 13, verse 18. We got people all over the place. We're told that Egypt's riches will be carried off to Babylon along with many people. We've already seen that in verse 4, but we'll see it also again in verses 17 and 18. Young men of Heliopolis and Bubastis will fall by the sword, and the cities themselves will go into captivity. Okay? This is part of what will happen there. There will be many idolatrous statues of Egypt that will be destroyed. The entire land will be left desolate from one end to the other. The Nile streams will be dried up. That is the effect of Egypt in any way. And Egypt's allies will also fall. These allies are claimed to be Cush, or Ethiopia, Lydia, and modern Turkey, Libya to the west of them, and a mixture of foreign mercenaries. So it's a comprehensive judgment that is awful. And God's purpose is accomplished that they might know Him. The Egyptians come to understand that He is Yahweh, the God of Israel. And since you could say they come to understand that He is the true God, He is the God of the people of Israel.
When we look at this, verse 17 of chapter 29, was He mute then, or was He speaking? Because He was mute till speaker came over, and this is the prophecy that's going to take place, and which came to him in the 27th year.
Right. Which is down at the end. So he's been open mouthed for a long time at that point. But even prior to that, as we've seen, when God wanted to speak in that point, He raised him up. But this one is we don't have any problems with as far at that point. I think what's happening here in 21, we kind of have a parenthesis for the exilic people that are hearing this, that you will be strengthened and emboldened by this, and this is the time when I will speak to you. Which is, He's put that chronologically out of place, but thematically at the time when they're right in the middle of the exile. In the middle of the siege. So you have to understand that what He's done here, His thematic emphasis has overruled the only really chronological change that He's making. A significant change that He's making here, because He wants people to see in this the beginning and the end of what's going to happen to Egypt. What is prophesied, what actually happened, is happening at the end time.
So when he spoke this, when he uttered it chronologically, but when he compiled it together, he put it thematically. Is that
right? Yes.
So this may have been uttered at one point of time, later on, after the siege.
And he leaves the date there, so we know that. He isn't trying to fool anybody about that. He says, no, this actually is a message that I gave down there. But I'm putting it here in the logical presentation of my message. That raises a whole very interesting discussion, which really isn't really what we're about at this point, but the whole issue of a prophet's writings and how they arrange what they do. I'm convinced, these things like this thoroughly convinced me that it isn't just haphazard. The prophets and the writers of Scripture don't just throw things at the page. Under the guidance of the Spirit of God, they are arranged to convey a message for those of us, as Paul says in Romans. They're written for our admonitions, for those that came before us as well. And they're written in a thematic, they're in a way of development. Same thing, people often say about the book of Jeremiah. I don't know if you've studied Jeremiah much. But Jeremiah just seems like, an anthology of messages, and what in the Sam Hill is this guy doing? Well, I don't know that I'm quite sure fully yet what he is doing, but one thing I am convinced of in light of the revelation of God is that there is a flow that goes on within Jeremiah. It isn't just haphazard, in that case. Here we see in many ways, you look at Ezekiel, and the guy's very methodical. He's got the chronology, he's got the thematic, and he adjusts that, but he doesn't do away with the chronology. He's not trying, he's not trying to deceive you at all. It's there, but I'm doing this for a reason thematically at this point, to drive my point home. Now, this brings us back, now that we got the bookends. It was prophesied, and then it's still a prophecy in 571, but it's now happening. It's going to happen immediately now. And we understand that there will be a time between the two. So guys here at the exile recognize that Egypt isn't going to fall on one big fell swoop. You're going to go from 586 at this point down to 571. We're talking about 15 years. And actually, as we say, we know that it's even after that, and the data we have would put it at around 568. So we're talking, about an extended period here, almost 20 years that it's going to be before Egypt actually is, the execution of the judgment of God upon Egypt is complete. But I want you to know now, guys, so that you can be emboldened and encouraged for that. So now the rest of the messages are really filling in between. Okay, go back chronologically and fill in between these two things. So in 30:20, we have a message which I call Pharaoh's broken arms. Now, if any of you have ever been to the museum and you've ever seen a pharaoh, one of the things that's stressed on pharaohs is their arms. and they've got these staffs, and they always have the bare arm, and that's the stress that you have in the statuary, because that's the symbol of their strength. You'll see these bas reliefs where the Pharaoh's out there grabbing all of the enemies by the hair and yanking them up, with the strength of his arm. I'd kind of like to watch him do that. It could be interesting, but anyhow, so the arm is the strength of them. So here, Hophra, if you remember, sought to interrupt. Well, I don't know if we do remember. Hophra tried to interrupt the siege of Jerusalem when Babylon was besieging Jerusalem. He did this during the year 588. And when during the year, we don't know. But Jeremiah tells us about it in Jeremiah 34:1 and 21:22 and 37:5, that he tried to interrupt this siege. Judeans' hopes, needless to say, you can imagine that, boy. Their hopes rose at that point. Here comes Hophra, here comes the answer. We all knew it was going to happen. Yippee! And he starts trying to stop this. Well, Nebuchadnezzar stopped for a moment and said, "Okay, you pest." And I'll put it this way. Hophra was unsuccessful. Okay? The Babylonians defeated Hophra and his army and sent them home. Sent them back to Egypt. After which, of course, Nebuchadnezzar renewed his siege upon Jerusalem. And this prophetic message is coming to us after or following Hophra's abortive intervention. So it's taking place, the date would be given to us at March, April 587. The siege is still going on at that point. And God declares that what he has done to Hophra, what God has done to Hophra through Babylon, is he has shattered Hophra's arm. Notice in verse 21, "Son of man, I have broken the arm of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. It has not been bound up for healing or put in a splint so as to become strong enough to hold a sword. Okay. Therefore, this is what Adonai Yahweh says, I am against Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. I will break both his arms, the good arm as well as the broken one, and make the sword fall from his hand. I will disperse the Egyptians among the nations and scatter them throughout the countries." There we have the dispersion again. "I will strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon and put my sword in his hand. But I will break the arms of Pharaoh, and he will groan before him like a mortal wounded man. I will strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon, but the arms of Pharaoh will fall limp. Then they will know that I am Yahweh when I put my sword into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he brandishes it against Egypt. And I will disperse the Egyptians among the nations and scatter them through the countries, and they will know that I am Yahweh." That's the message. Pretty clear cut. This guy goes away, he needs 2 slings. He got both arms broken. Which is if you break the one, you just render the guy totally ineffective by breaking both of them. He can't even hold a sword anymore. And that's exactly what the text says. And of course, the picture is clear. I don't think we have a whole lot of problems seeing the pictorial message. The sword is going to put in the hand and the arm of Nebuchadnezzar, and he will wield it against Hophra, and both arms will be broken. So this is a beautiful and suitable way of demonstrating that, but also note once again the dispersion of the people of Egypt. Then in chapter 31, in the entirety of 31, their fall is compared to the fall of Assyria. Now why? Well, this is delivered 2 months after the previous prophecy. So we come now to about May or June of 587. Siege still going on. The implication is that even though the power of Hophra has been broken and he was defeated in Jerusalem, both arms broken, he's still proud. And so God comes to him and says, let me talk about another little imagery here. There was a great cedar of Lebanon, and that great cedar of Lebanon represents Assyria in this concept. And Syria had recently fallen in 612 BC. Okay? That's the main fall of Syria. They had lingered on in 609 and 605. But really, they were doing that outside of Syria, over in Haran and in Carchemish. They were no longer in Assyria. This was the remnant of the army. But they fell in 612. And Egypt, in turn, says, will be compared to Assyria. The great cedar of Assyria was well watered. Well, who else thinks they're well watered? Egypt. Okay? Because both countries are dependent upon their rivers. In the case of Mesopotamia, it's the Tigris and the Euphrates. In the case of Egypt, it's the Nile. So it's an interesting parallel here. And we're going to have two trees, so to speak, in this case. Egypt has the unending supply of the Nile water. Syria had the unending supply of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Assyria is claimed here to be more beautiful and higher than any of the rest of the trees. In verse 5, we read that, let's start. He says, consider back in verse 3. Consider Assyria, once a cedar in Lebanon, with beautiful branches overshadowing the forest. It towered on high. Its top was above the thick foliage. The waters nourished its deep springs, made it grow tall. Their streams flowed all around its base and sent their channels to all the trees of the field, so it towered higher than all the trees of the field. Its boughs increased, its branches grew long, spreading because of the abundant waters. All the birds of the air nested in its bough, and the beasts of the fields gave their birth under its branches. All the great nations lived in its shade. By the way, that imagery you're going to pick up all the way through prophecy, even all the way to the revelation of the birds in the branches and the animals underneath is a picture of the nations being within that realm. Mm-hmm.
For example, like in Ezekiel 17, where is that the same kind of imagery we're talking about there?
Yes. Yeah. It was majestic in beauty, and its spreading boughs, for its roots went down to abundant waters. The cedars of the garden of God could not rival it. I don't think they were there right then, by the way. Nor could the pine trees equal its boughs. Nor could the plane trees. Take any tree you want. Compare with its branches. No tree in the garden of God could match its beauty. And you see here, by the way, the garden of God is using as a comparison of what is glorious and beautiful. Okay, I don't think they went over and checked out the garden of God at this point, if we want to talk about Eden. But that's the reference here. I made it beautiful with abundant branches, the envy of all the trees of Eden. The garden of God, in the garden of God. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, because it towered on high, lifting up its top above the thick foliage, and because of its pride of its height, pride. There we come again, pride. So the height and the grandeur has created pride. I handed it over to the ruler of the nations for him to deal with according to its wickedness, and I cast it aside. And the most ruthless foreign nations cut it down and left it. That was Babylon. Babylon is continually referred to as the most ruthless of all of them. Okay? Its boughs fell on the mountains and in the valleys. Its branches were broken in the ravines of the land. All the nations of the earth came out from under its shade and left. All the birds of the air settled on the fallen tree, and all the beasts of the fields were among its branches. Therefore no other trees by the waters were ever to tower so proudly on high, lifting up the tops above the thick foliage. No other trees so well watered are ever to reach such a height. They are all destined for death, for the earth below, among mortal men, with those who go down to the pit. So he's taken quite a bit of time to tell you how marvelous Assyria was. Okay? But he also tells you that nobody else is going to get there. Okay? Verse 15, on the day that it was brought down to the grave, I covered the springs deep with mourning for it. I held back its streams. Its abundant waters were restrained. Because of it, I clothed Lebanon with gloom And all the trees of the field withered away, and I made the nations tremble at the sound of its fall when I brought it down to the grave with those who go down to the pit. And all the trees of Eden, the choicest, the best of Lebanon. By the way, that's an apposition there. All the trees that were well watered were consoled in the earth. Those who lived in its shades, its allies among the nations, had also gone down to the grave with it, joining those killed by the sword. Which of the trees of Eden can compare with you in splendor and majesty? Yet you too will be brought down with the trees of Eden to the earth below, and you will lie among the uncircumcised with those killed by the sword. This is Pharaoh and all his hordes, declares Adonai Yahweh. We just have those last verse. But it's a potent statement. Verse 1 to 17, he's saying to the king of Egypt and to his hordes, who can be compared with you in majesty? Consider Assyria. And he spends the rest of the chapter talking about how glorious and wonderful is Assyria. Only to come to 18 and say, which of the trees of Eden can be compared with you in splendor and majesty? To Egypt. Yet you too will be brought down with the trees of Eden to the earth below, and you will lie among the uncircumcised. There again, the disgraceful death with those killed by the sword. This is Pharaoh. I'm telling you now, you want to know who I'm talking about specifically? Pharaoh and all his hordes. You know, your pride, your splendor, well, I'll tell you what, even better than you is Assyria. You don't even compare. And Assyria didn't make it, and neither will you. Egypt, you're not going to make it either. Assyria became proud and fell. You have become proud, and you will fall. You will be cut down, you'll be cast aside. You're no different than Assyria. Chapter 32 is a funeral dirge. You remember what funeral dirges are? Guys, you're dead. I'm going to sing your funeral dirge for you. February, March 585. Notice these things are all right there during and immediately following the siege, the collapse of Jerusalem that follows. 2 months had passed since the exiles had learned of Jerusalem's fall when Ezekiel gives this message there among the exiles. And they had begun to comprehend that Yahweh did exist, by the way. And he was faithful to destroy Jerusalem. Perhaps they were wondering too whether God would be faithful to punish all of the heathen nations also. And conversely, Egypt had seen the collapse of Jerusalem and may have begun to gloat in pride in this situation over her own survival and her own power. Unless the exiles begin questioning their new understanding of God's faithfulness, this funeral dirge is announced over Egypt that God is faithful to what he says. That's a message that comes through continually through the book of Ezekiel and should reverberate within our own lives. God is faithful to what he says in the Word of God. I hope if you don't get anything else, you get that from the book of Ezekiel. God says what he means, and what he says he will do. You can count on it. He is faithful. He is immutable also. He never changes. It's one of the greatest attributes of God. Okay, so we have this funeral dirge where he portrays Egypt as dead. And this funeral dirge is being sung, it says, by the daughters of the nations as they watch Egypt expire. So the nations are all watching this, singing the funeral dirge as Egypt dies and deceases. Really, this message is a recapitulation, of the judgment messages that we've already been hearing on Egypt. You know, it's going to emphasize Egypt's false pride, and it's going to bewail her fate. You know, that's the way the funeral dirge goes. You talk first of all about the splendor. Well, the splendor is demonstrated ultimately in the energetic pride of Pharaoh, but his strength will be ineffective, and God will bring him out like that crocodile, like a young lion or a thrashing crocodile, that the text here says only muddied the water. That's a very vivid description that he states about him. He says, notice in verse 3, as the lament starts, you are like a lion among the nations. You're like a crocodile in the seas, thrashing about in your streams, churning up the water with your feet and muddying the streams. Yeah, all you did was muddy the water, my friend. You didn't carry out a lot more than that. You muddied the streams for us here. And the crocodile will be captured, hurled out into the open field. The carnage will be so great that it'll fill every ravine and mountain. We've been there before. Already heard this message. This is a recapitulation in the lament. And darkness will cover the land. By the way, that's in it. Why is that significant when it says darkness will cover the land in Egypt? Okay, the chief deity of Egypt is Re, the sun god. Well, when you go back to the plagues of Egypt in Exodus, those plagues, the majority of them are specifically directed towards the gods and goddesses of Egypt. So when the sun goes dark in Egypt, and you got some real theological problems that you have to deal with in that case. Verses 11 to 16 are, in a sense, aiding in the interpretation of the imagery that's there, in case we haven't gotten the message. The slaughter will be in the hands of the Babylonians, we're told. He says, the sword of the king of Babylon will come against you, and I will cause your hordes to fall by the swords of mighty men, the most ruthless of all the nations. There's that description again. Babylon is the most ruthless, I'll get it right here in a minute, most ruthless of all nations. Everyone, everything will be touched by this discipline. Egypt's pride will be shattered. We've already seen that shattering demonstrated in the broken arms. It's finished. And this is a lament that is being sung by the daughters of the nation. But, in 16, this is the lament they will chant for her. The daughters of the nations will chant it for Egypt. All her hordes will chant it, declares the sovereign Lord. And in verse 17, in the 12th year, in the 15th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, you wail for the hordes of Egypt and consign the earth below, both her and her daughters to the mighty nations with those who go down to the pit. And so now we have Ezekiel singing his lament. Well, this is a concert of laments here at this time. And this is the final prophecy, verses 17 to 32, against Egypt. We had the bookends, and now we've just been told the details of it, and then we have the funeral laments given. This is really what makes up the judgments against Egypt. Really, in many ways, a continual repetition with some detail along the way of the same messages that they're going to be judged because of their pride and because of the fact that they have not been a reliable support to Egypt, to Judah, in any way. And therefore God will bring Babylon against her and leave the land desolate, and they will go in dispersion to Babylon for 40 years. So this concludes the oracle against Egypt and also the oracles against the nations that are there. And here Ezekiel wails for the Egyptians because they have descended into the pit of death, as have all other mighty nations that preceded them. Egypt will not be favored in any way. Notice we read in verse 17, in the 12th year, in the 15th, the word in verse 18, the Son of Man, wail for the hordes of Egypt, and consign to the earth below both her and the daughters of the mighty nations with those who go down to the pit. Say to them, are you more favored than others? Go down and be laid among the uncircumcised. Oh, how terrible! I got a life in death, because remember that to the Egyptians, the afterlife, man, that went on. It was a long journey. You mean I'm going to have to live with uncircumcised people? Oh no, God forbid. How could that ever be? It's a disgrace for them in this place. You think you're better than they are? You think you're favored? No, you're going to be right there with them. Say to them, in verse 20, they will fall among those killed with the sword. The sword is drawn. Let her be dragged off with all her hordes from within the grave. The mighty leaders will say of Egypt and her allies. Now this is what the others that have already died, the other mighty guys that are down there, they're having I couldn't say they're having a party. I don't think you're going to have much of a party there. But anyhow, there's some talking going on. Okay? And they're saying here, as Egypt comes in the door of death and comes into their... They say in the picture lesson here, from within the grave, the mighty leaders will say of Egypt and her allies, quote, they have come down, and they will lie with the uncircumcised, with those killed by the sword. They're just like all the rest of us. They're no different. You're so proud, Egypt. You're going to be just like everybody else in death. By the way, that's true for everybody else. If you're in Sheol or if you're in heaven, we're all going to be there together. Nobody has a corner on the market at that point, and I hope we're in the right place. Assyria is there with her whole army. She's surrounded by the graves of all her slain. So she's there. Their graves are in the depth of the pit, and her army lies around her graves. All who spread terror in the land are living or slain, fallen by the sword. Elam's there. So he goes and talks about all the different ones that are there. All the different ones. Meshach, Tubal, talks about, and verse 28, and you too, Pharaoh, will be broken and will lie among the uncircumcised with those killed by the sword. Edom's there. Yeah, she's there also. All the princes of the north and all the Sidonians are there. Even got Tyre in there because they're in the princes of the north. Pharaoh, he and all his army in verse 31 will see them, and he will be consoled, if you could have such a thing, for all his hordes that were killed by the sword, declares Adonai Yahweh. Although I had spread terror in the land of the living, Pharaoh and all his hordes will be laid among the uncircumcised with those killed by the sword, declares Adonai Yahweh. The end. It's over, Egypt. So between the two bookends of the first two messages against Egypt, we have these details of the invasion by Babylon, knowing specifically who's going to do this, the dispersion of Egypt, the lament by the nations, the daughters of the nation, which rehearses the pride and then the judgment, and then the weeping and the wailing and the lament of Ezekiel for them. So it's a shameful death, but it's a death that comes of one who thought they were proud. And even in their death, notice the emphasis, how it's made so much, and you will lie among the uncircumcised. Because that was such a disgrace to them. And you will lie among the uncircumcised. Probably says that 4 or 5 times within the passage. The point coming, you're no better than those you thought were bad. And that the type of attitude and thinking that's there should be somewhat of a challenge to us. How do we think about people? The only difference we have with anyone else is to be able to say, by God's grace, I am a child of God. Otherwise, we're all equal. No difference. I'm just as sinful as anybody else. I have that capacity. But by the grace of God, I am a child of God.
True that. I said true that. Amen.
Amen. And there's no place for pride on our part, at any part. When I see the guy out there that looks all dirty and dressed in different ways than I am and does things different than I am, and he's drunk and whatever else it may be, and he's in the pit of sin, that could be me. Only by the grace of God. And I need to get the message to him. That's my job. I'm to be a priest, and I'm to get the message to him. Pride can easily slip in subtle ways, even to where I don't want to be with people, because their personality rubs me the wrong way, or whatever it may be. Okay? They all need Jesus, just like I needed Jesus. Ezekiel 33, 1 to 20, is kind of a transition here. In some ways, what this is doing, it's concluding the judgment messages against Judah and the foreign nations, and then turning and almost giving a renewed commission to Ezekiel, as now we're going to see within the book the latter part of the book and the hope and the restoration that would come. But part of what's going to happen here in this book is, Judah, be careful. Just because the nations are going to be judged, don't you do what they've done. And we had that message before to Ezekiel. Don't be like the rebellious people. That's a good principle to keep in our mind. Don't let those who, so to speak, are our enemies cause us to act like them because of the way they act. Let's don't do what they do. The temptation can be easy to do that. So, let's say it's kind of closing the message. It's opening a new thing, and we're going to have concepts here that we've heard before. They're not new. Okay? We're going to see Ezekiel's commission as a watchman brought up again and talked about. And we're going to see his exhortation that we saw in chapter 18 concerning the individual responsibility. This also is going to be brought up again and discussed in this transitional time between them. Ezekiel had very faithfully performed his role as a watchman. The warnings are over. Okay? Now he's going to be able to do that fun part of the ministry, you might say, to encourage the people in the hope that they have. And you may be that too. We never, we're not the ones that choose what our ministry is. It's God who chooses, and we may have ministry that isn't real pleasant, like the first chapters of Ezekiel, or the role he was called to be a watchman, to give the warnings. And after a while, you'd like to say something nice. In the Armenian theology that I find frequent in the part of the world where I'm living, I call it a hopeless hope. And I sometimes sit in a message and I hear somebody rant and rave and talk about how sinful everybody is and they need to get saved again. And our things often, messages sometimes are negative because of the context in which they're living. And I sometimes want to stand up and yell, "Can't you ever encourage your people?" And so men, do encourage your people. You may also have to announce judgment. But it's the fun part's the encouragement. And we need to do that as well. So Ezekiel had been very faithful as he performed his task as a watchman. He had warned the people on this, and now, in a sense, 3 to 4 months prior to this present message, Ezekiel had encouraged the people with the messages of hope in chapters 33:21 to 39:20. And so Ezekiel has, in a sense, been exonerated from the guilt for destruction and captivity that the people wanted to lay upon him. They now knew that there was a prophet among them, a responsible watchman. And so he gives them, in a sense, one final warning, if I could put it that way, and that is, turn now to Yahweh. Why die? Okay? So notice what he says here. He says, The word of the Lord came to him, Son of man, speak to your country and say to them, when I bring the sword against the land, and the people of the land choose one of their men and make him the watchman, and he sees the sword coming against the land and blows the trumpet to warn the people, then if anyone hears the trumpet but does not take the warning, the sword comes and takes his life. His blood will be on his own head. Since he heard the sound of the trumpet but did not take warning, his blood will be upon his own head. If he had taken warning, he would have saved himself. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet to warn the people, and the sword comes and takes the life of one of them, that man will be taken away because of his sin, but I will hold the watchman accountable for his blood. Now we've had that before, back in chapter 3. Now, Son of man, verse 7, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give them, we could almost say, the last warning from me. When you say to the wicked, O wicked man, you will surely die, and you do not speak out to dissuade him from his ways, that wicked man will die for his sin, and I will hold you accountable for his blood. Men, don't just denounce sin and preach condemnation, but always help people to get out of their situation by the gospel. Okay? But if you do warn the wicked man to turn from his ways, and he does not do so, he will die for his sin, but you have saved yourself. Son of man, say to the house of Israel, this is what you're saying. Our offenses and sins weigh us down, and we are wasting away because of them. How then can we live? I mean, we're burdened, we're overladen with our sin. How are we going to live? So say to them, so what you're supposed to say to them. Say to them, as surely as I live, declares Adonai Yahweh, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Turn. Turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, O house of Israel? There's the good news. Turn to Yahweh. Therefore, Son of man, say to your countrymen, the righteousness of the righteous man will not save him when he disobeys, and the wickedness of the wicked man will not cause him to fall when he turns from it. The righteous man, if he sins, will not be allowed to live because of his former righteousness. If I tell the righteous man that he will surely live, but then he trusts in his righteousness and does evil, none of the righteous things he has done will be remembered. He will die for the evil he has done. And if I say to the wicked man, you shall surely die, but he then turns from his sin and does what is just and right, if he gives back what he took in the pledge for loan and returns what he has stolen and follows the decrees that give life and does no evil, he will surely live. He will not die. None of the sins he has committed will be remembered against him. He has done what is just and right. He will surely live. And we heard all of that back in chapter 18. Simply a review concerning the individual responsibility. Yet your countrymen say, the way of the Lord is not just. But it is their way that is not just. If a righteous man turns from his righteousness and does evil, he will die for it. And if a wicked man turns from his wickedness and does what is just and right, he will live by doing so. Yet, O house of Israel, you say the way of the Lord is not just, but I will judge each of you according to his own ways. And there's still some who are saying it isn't fair. But you have the message being pled. You have to make a decision. It's an individual responsibility. And some are saying our sins are burdened upon us. We can't bear them. They're absolutely right. They can. Give them to someone who can. And turn to the Lord and live. Don't just give the warning, but give the way of escape. And the prophets were faithful to do that. And so was Ezekiel. And so what's going to proceed in verse 21 and following now is that great hope that the people have in these verses, the blessing and the hope that is upon them. First, the section of Ezekiel 33 to 21 to 39 and 29 is a series of night messages of hope and encouragement. Ezekiel 40 to 48 will discuss the return of God's glory to the millennial temple and worship in a renewed land. So we want to go and talk about the messages of hope and encouragement here beginning in 31:21. And he's going to turn and kind of set the scene, set the landmark chronologically, and deal with an issue that the people now ask. We've seen them ask questions before. It's a very good thing, ask questions. They have a question now that Jerusalem has fallen, and this question and much of what's going to be discussed in these chapters from 33:21 through the end of 39 have to do with the land. Keep that in mind. The land is very strategic in these chapters, and in these messages are given that night. Now, what do we mean by that night? Well, verse 21. In the 12th year of our exile, in the 10th month, on the 5th day, a man who had escaped from Jerusalem came to me and said, "The city has fallen." Okay, that's the fugitive that left. Remember the fall of Jerusalem back in chapter 24? And we've had kind of a thematic parenthesis where we've talked about the judgment upon the nations and how that you really can't separate those from judgment upon Judah. The principles are the same. We need to understand the cause, and we need to understand the result and the consequence of everybody, whether it be Judah or the nations, is Babylon is going to be the instrument of judgment. So they're kind of all in the pot together, so to speak, in that case. So we pick up again here after this thematic parentheses, and we talk about, okay, we go on chronologically. Now, this fugitive has now returned, and he comes here on the 21st, and he is going to say to them, Jerusalem has fallen. That's what he says to Ezekiel. Then notice we go on to read 22. Now the evening before the man arrived. It's a very strategic chronological statement. So he says, the man arrived and told me Jerusalem has fallen, but the evening before. Okay? Now I can't tell you whether the guy arrived in the morning or the afternoon. But anyhow, the evening before that, the man arrived. The hand of the Lord was upon me. Now that always happens when he's going to make significant communication. And now the hand of the Lord is upon him and to strengthen him. And he opened my mouth before the man came. Before, not after. This is in the night before. God's hand was upon him, and he opened the mouth of Ezekiel. So my mouth was open, and I was no longer silent. So now he can move about among his people, and he is now going to make proclamations to them in the night before the guy arrives. And these messages in 33:21 through the chapter 39 were given in one night. They're all dated at the same time. This is the date for all of them. We don't have a new date, chronological date, until we come to 40 verse 1. Okay? So, these are given before the man arrives with the news that Jerusalem has fallen. And as I have said before, and looking forward to this is the grace and the love of God to encourage his people with the hope they have before they hear that what they've been putting their trust in is gone. And God, I think, delights to do that type of thing. He desires to bless. Always has. Go back to Genesis 12:3. I will bless those, plural, who bless you, and the singular one who curses you I will curse. Plurality is often used in the Hebrew language for emphasis. And the point he's trying to make is, my great desire and my great emphasis and the thing that I want to do more than anything else is to bless. That's my great desire. And God desires to bless. Though blessing and cursing is very much part of God's covenant program. And of course, it's very important to understand when you come to these chapters, God's covenant program. Because as we mentioned before, the Mosaic covenant in the blessing and cursing section can only offer blessing if there's obedience to the Mosaic covenant. And part of the blessing is the fact of appropriating all the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant and the others. Whether it's true whether you're the king in the Davidic covenant or whether you're one of the people in the Abrahamic covenant. The covenants are important because the message now of hope is based upon the Abrahamic, the Davidic, and the New Covenant. Okay? That's the basis in the unconditional covenants for the hope that they had. And so he will do that. But as he begins now in this, he's going to tell them that Jerusalem, to the exiles, again, keep in mind, they don't know yet that it's fallen. But they have a pretty good idea that things don't look too good. You know, in light of the last message, they know the siege is on. Things are going. So he's going to look at the question on their part about the land. You know, is this, after all, in the Abrahamic covenant, he's going to create the nation of Israel. The promise was that he would, and the very fact that Israel would exist, they had to have a land. Land is very much part of the existence of the people as a nation. And they're outside of the land. Are we going to lose it? Is it gone? That's a very logical question on their part. You know, this is part of the very core of our being, the land. And I think we have to understand the land that way. It's very much, it's a part of being a people. As we mentioned, we have to have three basic elements, if not more, of being a people. And that is, you got to have people. And to be a nation, you have to have people. You have to have a homeland somewhere where you live as a people. And then some sort of an organization, some sort of a unity, which is done through normally what you would call a constitution. And so they're asking the question now, well, do we have a land, you know, at this point? Is it still ours? So as we read here, he says then in verse 23, the Lord came to me, Son of man, the people are living in those ruins in the land of Israel, and the people in Israel are saying, Avram was only one man, yet he possessed the land. But we are many. Surely the land has been given to us as our possession. So the concern is it still ours? And we're in the midst of siege at this time. Are we going to lose this? Are we going to lose Jerusalem? Are we going to lose the land? Therefore say to them, this is what Adonai Yahweh says. Since you eat meat with blood still in it, and look to your idols and shed blood, should you then possess the land? In other words, if you are disobedient to the Mosaic covenant, should you be appropriating the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant? Because Deuteronomy 7:12, Deuteronomy 8:1, and others will say as at that time, if you will follow the stipulations of the covenant that I am giving you now, and that's the Mosaic covenant, you will experience the blessings of the covenant I gave to your forefathers. Now, the Abrahamic covenant does not change, nor does its blessings change on whether they obey the Mosaic covenant or not. It's an unconditional covenant. Okay? I hope that's very clear. It's the appropriation of the blessing or not. Depends on whether they obey God's covenant with Moses. It tells them how to live righteously. And by the way, the new covenant replaces the old covenant. But the principle is still the same. As we obey the new covenant by faith, trusting in Jesus, we appropriate the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. Okay? But if at any point in time we are disobedient to God, we're not going to experience all of the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. They're still there. They haven't gone away. We haven't destroyed them by our disobedience at all. They're there waiting for us to grab hold. And that's just another way of looking at that concept is the way we live today. Now, they're wanting to know, are they in 24 here? The question is being asked on their part indirectly. Abraham, he had it, but we're many, and why don't we have it? So if you're going to be disobedient, you don't. But say to them, in verse 27, this is what Adonai Yahweh says, as surely as I live, those who are left in the ruins will fall by the sword. Those out of the country I will give to the wild animals to be devoured. We've already heard these things. And those in the stronghold and caves will die of a plague. I will make the land a desolate waste, and her proud strength will come to an end. And the mountains of Israel will become desolate, so that no one will cross them. Then they will know that I am Yahweh, when I have made the land a desolate waste because of all the detestable things you've done. As for you, son of man, your countrymen are talking together about you. Well, what he's saying to this point is, it's yours. The land has gone away. It's still the promise. It's still part of the people. Of a people that obey me. Who genuinely obey me and walk in my ways. So the land is strategic to them. And I said the land is strategic to these chapters. Will they be separated from the land? Only if they separate themselves in disobedience. Which they have done at this point, but if they turn to Him, there's the restoration, and they're part of it. They go right back. Okay? Now, interesting comments here in this beginning chapter about Ezekiel himself. Verse 30, as for you, son of man, your countrymen are talking together about you by the walls and at the doors of the houses. You ever had anybody talk about you? Well, they talked about prophets, even though it's like they talk about preachers today. And they're talking about you, saying to each other, come, hear the message that has come from the Lord. My people come to you, as they usually do, and sit before you to listen to your words. But they do not put them into practice. I'm sure you don't experience that. You don't listen to your sermon? Oh, it was a very nice sermon. Thank you, Pastor. I'm supposed to do this? Oh, that's a unique and novel idea. Maybe that I might put this into practice. No, they're listening, but they don't put it into practice. With their mouths, they express devotion. Yeah, they greet you at the door. This is wonderful. You're a wonderful pastor. It's a wonderful message. I just love it. I always am tempted to say to them, what did I say? We sometimes love it when something is erudite or nice. Never forget once walking out of the Wheaton College Chapel, and Wheaton College students at times were quite enamored with those who were, they thought, quite intellectual. And I remember this guy came and spoke, and he spoke very eruditely and used all the big words and all these things. And I sat there trying to figure out, what in the world is the guy saying? And they're walking out, and I overhear these students saying to one another as they're walking, wasn't that wonderful? Oh, it was so clear. It was so great. It was one of the best messages I've ever heard. I couldn't restrain myself. I said, what did he say? There was silence. They didn't know what he said. It's just because they didn't know what he said, that's why it was wonderful and great. You know? And by the way, that's the way some people think. If I don't understand it, it must be the guy must really be intellectual. Well, either that or we're stupid. I don't know which one you want to put it that for. But, here they are. They listen with their mouth, they express devotion. Oh, it's great. But their hearts are greedy for unjust gain. All they're thinking about is me. Don't confuse me with the Word of God. Don't confuse me with things that will ask me to do something different than my lifestyle is. Their hearts were greedy for unjust gain. Tells you where the people were. Money, material things. It's a death knell. I can remember also a woman in Vienna that spoke in the Women's World Day of Prayer on the very day after the collapse of communism. The very year after the collapse of communism in 1990. Just so happened a woman from Czechoslovakia had been chosen as the speaker, the keynote speaker for that time, before the collapse of communism. And suddenly it had collapsed in between after the time they asked her, and so she came to Vienna to speak in 1990. In the midst of her speaking, she said this. She says, we have survived the political bondage. I don't think we will probably survive the material bondage. And I would say I see the effect of materialism, unfortunately, creeping in more and more each day into that part of the world. And it's deadening. Nothing is more deadening than the material quest on the part of man. Indeed, he goes on in verse 32, to them you are nothing more than one who sings love songs with a beautiful voice and plays an instrument well. Probably could fit into a lot of our worship services. For they hear your words, but they do not put them into practice. He's just an entertainer. That's the way it's fun to watch him. Look at all those strange, weird things he does, And he sings all these nice songs and plays a beautiful instrument. And we listen to those, but you don't have to do that, do you? You don't need to put that into practice. When all this comes true, and it surely will, then they will know that a prophet has been among them. He wasn't an entertainer. He was a prophet. Men, don't be an entertainer. Don't tickle ears. And there's a lot of pastors out there that really have become nothing more than entertainers. Okay? We don't need any more entertainers. We need people that will speak the Word of God in truth and with accuracy, so that they'll know that there's been a prophet among them. When the things came to pass, when they became true, they knew the prophet had been among them. No, he wasn't an entertainer. He was communicating in every way he could, trying to get through to us with the truth of Almighty God. We just didn't listen, or when we did, we didn't pay any attention and we didn't put it into practice. And I trust that will not be said of us, because we can listen to and not put it into practice. And it's because we think we already know. That's one of the things we have to live with when we study and are in theological education. We can become duped to think I already know it all. And I've actually had people sometimes say to me, why are we studying that book again? I've already studied that book. Mercy. Every time I study the Word of God, I learn. I don't care if I've done it 10 times. You learn. It's inexhaustible. So let's not be entertainers. Let's be those who are prophets.